Official bulletins highlighted the number of prisoners captured in the Soviet Union, the speed of the advance, and the apparent weakness of the enemy. It was asserted that the total collapse of the Soviet Union was a matter of only a few weeks. In print media and on the radio, maps displayed new territories coming under German control, while communiques issued by the High Command spoke of uninterrupted victories. The population received these messages with a mixture of enthusiasm, relief, and a sense of historical destiny. For many Germans, the war in the East was not merely a continuation of previous wars, but a decisive conflict. However, the High Command witnessed some variance in perspective. Although a general sense of optimism prevailed, some officers expressed doubts regarding the logistical capacity to maintain the momentum of an attack on such a vast front. Supply difficulties, vehicle breakdowns, and the need to secure rear lines were constant sources of anxiety. The speed of the advance was simultaneously their greatest strength and their greatest risk. Every new kilometer gained pushed units further away from their supply centers. Furthermore, the Soviet enemy, despite the chaos that prevailed initially, began to reorganize its ranks in certain sectors. At specific points along the front, enemy forces presented a more cohesive defense, which slowed the German advance. Despite these indicators, the figures in the first months of the campaign remained staggering. In the initial operations, more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in several pockets, such as Minsk, Smolensk, and Uman. Territories under German control were expanding. Panzer divisions opened deep breaches in enemy lines, encircling large battalions and causing continuous breakthroughs. German commanders believed that 1 or 2 additional blows would be sufficient to force the fall of Moscow and dismantle the Soviet command capability. The entire strategy was based on the premise of a short war. Within this framework, military objectives took priority over the systematic occupation of land. Over the following weeks, the situation remained favorable for the invaders. The advance on the Eastern Front continued, and German forces reached the Dnieper River, the Dwina River, and other major natural barriers. Specialized engineering units built bridges and repaired railways to facilitate the advance. Cities were occupied quickly, often found partially emptied of their inhabitants. Fear of the German enemy spread among the local population, and although occupation orders were characterized by ideological hostility, the focus of the military command remained on securing territories and tightening control over them. With the continued advance, the rhetoric of victory remained unchanged. In Berlin, Hitler's public statements reflected his conviction that the campaign had entered its final stages. The idea of the Soviet Union as a giant with feet of clay seemed to be proven true by the absence of effective defense in the early months. The message that communism was dying and that history was witnessing a radical transformation of the continent was reinforced. The propaganda machine intensified its activity, presenting soldiers as harbingers of a new era. Newsreels showed tanks crossing endless vast plains, German flags fluttering in distant villages, and maps showing the front line moving steadily toward Moscow. The general feeling among the German people was one of confidence. Accustomed to hearing good news for nearly 2 years, the population assumed that this new campaign would be another proof of their superiority. The figures in the communiques fed this impression, with every new bulletin mentioning thousands of additional prisoners, cities captured by German forces, and new advances. Posters and leaflets depicted the Red Army as a chaotic, archaic, and unresponsive force. Even those who harbored personal doubts about the duration of the conflict preferred not to express them publicly. Social pressure, censorship, and the collective desire for victory kept the political discourse cohesive. Official propaganda tried to maintain morale through heroic tales, images of smiling soldiers, and optimistic bulletins in German newspapers. Newsreels reported successful advances, cities controlled by German forces, and collapsing Soviet resistance. But those on the front saw something different. Destroyed cities offered no refuge or resources. Populations that had been evacuated or exterminated left behind barren landscapes. Human casualties escalated. Instead of granting a sense of control, the territories provided a space for permanent tension. Some soldiers kept small notes with motivational phrases that no longer touched their conscience. The gap between the official narrative and the true experience became glaring every day. Yet, many did not allow themselves to doubt openly. They clung to what they knew, repeated their officers' words, and believed in final victory as a psychological refuge rather than a strategic certainty. Letters from family played a crucial role. News from home was one of the few consolations available to soldiers. Although these letters were brief, they curbed the soldiers' feeling of being abandoned. However, even in their letters, soldiers began to convey their dissatisfaction through oblique phrases that managed to pass censorship, but clearly conveyed the emotional burden of the front. Some spoke of the hard life there, endless nights or unending lands, while others clearly admitted their fear, frustration with conditions, or lack of understanding regarding the slow progress. Camaraderie was also turbulent. While strong bonds were built, tensions also arose. Fatigue bred arguments, sparked friction, and led to despair. Not everyone coped at the same rate. Some turned to alcohol where available. Others turned to isolation or reckless behavior. Although official discipline was maintained, the command noticed symptoms of a purely functional army that was beginning to show signs of extreme fatigue. The geographic distance also became clear in communication with the High Command. Orders arrived late or contradictory, sometimes based on old maps or inaccurate assumptions. The reality on the ground contradicted reports coming from Berlin. The enemy, supposed to collapse within a few weeks, continued to fight. Soviet units reorganized for counterattacks, forcing German units to retreat. Every new attempt to advance required resources, effort, and additional lives. The initial enthusiasm that accompanied the start of the operation vanished completely, replaced by a conviction of slow progress with no clear goal. The feeling of invincibility was no longer up for debate. In its place, a sad acceptance of the cruelty of the Eastern Front prevailed, characterized by routine and patience rather than expectations of a quick victory. In this context, soldiers turned to personal beliefs, rituals, or superstitions. They hung their hopes on specific actions before going on patrol, repeated certain phrases before sleep, or carried amulets or hidden family photos in their pockets as a way to feel safer and retain some control amidst the general chaos. Emotional distance from the rear lines also increased. What they witnessed on the front was hard to describe, even hard to accept. Some soldiers began to feel that no one but their comrades could understand what they were going through. The sense of isolation deepened with every passing week. Expectations of a quick return vanished. Talk of returning was no longer linked to specific dates, but phrases like, "when this is over," or "if we survive this." The concept of time became elastic. All days became alike, and it seemed the clock hands had stopped moving. Only the seasons made a difference, and sometimes even they were not enough to distinguish change. Without fail, some recorded their experiences in personal diaries hidden among their clothes or luggage. What was written in them, sometimes brief, sometimes lengthy, offered a raw, intimate look at what was really happening. They spoke of the fear of sleep, of wounded comrades who could not be evacuated, and marches that lasted over 12 hours non-stop. These were interspersed with reflections, doubts, and long silences, occasionally broken by phrases like, "This is not what we imagined," though few dared to say it aloud due to the weight of discipline, propaganda, and ideological direction. The gap between the image of the front in Berlin's rhetoric and what soldiers were living on the ground became clearer day by day. Life on the Eastern Front could not be compared to any previous experiences in the Wehrmacht. The environment gnawed at the will and tested the physical and psychological control of every man. In that vast hostile space, where the enemy was not just another army, but also the climate, the mud, disease, and loneliness, German soldiers kept marching forward because they had no other choice. Since the early years of the Nazi regime, individuals and groups appeared, albeit in isolation, beginning to express their doubts or rejection of imposed policies. Some did so silently, avoiding public displays of loyalty, while others dared to express dissenting opinions in private gatherings. As the war progressed, these scattered signals took new forms. Despite their small numbers, they led to the emergence of pockets of opposition that could no longer be ignored by the authorities. Among the most active of these groups were university students, intellectuals, and church members. Small groups emerged from universities, analyzing the state of the country with a spirit of solidarity. One of the most famous was the White Rose Group, formed mainly of Munich students like Hans and Sophie Scholl. These young people wrote and distributed leaflets questioning the atrocities committed, especially on the Eastern Front, and appealing to the moral conscience of citizens to resist the regime. They did not propose an armed revolution, but a moral awakening. The state's reaction was immediate and violent. They were arrested, interrogated, and sentenced to death in summary trials. At the same time, other young people, not university students, expressed their dissatisfaction in the streets. The so-called Edelweiss Pirates appeared, a group of youths who rejected party discipline and compulsory ideological indoctrination by organizing secret meetings, singing banned songs, and disrupting Hitler Youth activities. These groups were not organized into a formal structure and did not seek to overthrow the regime, but their mere existence was a challenge to the imposed uniformity. Some members were arrested, while others were executed without trial. The Church also attempted to provide some space for dissent, however limited. The Catholic and Protestant churches tried to maintain a degree of doctrinal independence. In some cases, clergy spoke out against compulsory euthanasia or racial persecution. For example, Bishop Clemens von Galen delivered public sermons criticizing the killing of the disabled. Although he was not arrested, many of his colleagues were, and the Gestapo monitored his activities closely. Within the army ranks, elements also emerged that began to question the country's direction. Some officers, disillusioned by the course of the war or shaken by the crimes they witnessed in occupied territories, began planning in secret. These concerns eventually translated into a more ambitious and organized attempt to assassinate Hitler. The July 20th plot of 1944, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. The plan's goal was to plant a bomb in the headquarters, Wolf's Lair, eliminate the party leadership, and establish a government seeking to negotiate peace. The operation was carefully designed, involving many senior army officers. The bomb exploded as planned, but Hitler survived with minor injuries, and the attempt unraveled within hours. The regime's response was immediate. Mass arrests were ordered, and purges were carried out within the army and civil administration. More than 5,000 people were arrested, many with no direct link to the attack. Executions continued without interruption. Some were hanged with piano wire, others beheaded. Many were sentenced in proceedings that were, in reality, mere formalities. The trials were filmed and used as a tool for intimidation. Repression was directed not only at the perpetrators of the attack, but extended to their relatives, friends, and collaborators, whether real or suspected, applying the principle of collective responsibility. Sippenhaft. If an individual was accused of treason, their inner circle could also be punished, following a logic that sought to eradicate any potential future eruption of opposition. The message was clear. There would be no tolerance for the slightest gesture of opposition within German society. People's perception of these actions was uneven. A significant portion of the population, influenced by propaganda and subject to strict censorship, accepted the official narrative portraying the conspirators as traitors and cowards. Public speeches glorified absolute loyalty to the Führer and demanded exemplary punishment. However, doubts began to creep into certain sectors, especially among those suffering directly from the war's consequences. Some saw these acts as an expression of despair, while others interpreted them as proof that not everyone shared the path the country had taken. Regime propaganda adapted in response. On one hand, it reinforced the image of national unity and unwavering loyalty, portraying Hitler as the victim of a conspiracy of traitors. On the other hand, it intensified rhetoric against internal enemies, comparing dissidents to saboteurs and spies. Posters were distributed, public events organized, and campaigns launched to denounce any defeatist behavior. Ultimately, surveillance became omnipresent. Simultaneously, the experience of the attack left traces in the inner circle. Hitler, deeply affected by what happened, became more suspicious. He distanced himself further from his advisors, reorganized his security, and ordered new protocols to prevent any similar attempt. Tension in his relationship with the Wehrmacht increased. The powers of the SS expanded, and supervisory bodies multiplied. The memory of those who dared to resist, from a student distributing leaflets to a soldier risking his life in an impossible conspiracy, remained fragmented throughout the conflict. Some were forgotten immediately. Others were portrayed as traitors for years. Recognition of them as symbols of conscience did not begin until long after the regime's collapse. Although a minority, the flame was not completely extinguished. Internal resistance in Nazi Germany failed to change the course of the war, but it revealed that even under the most repressive regimes in history, there were voices ready to question, challenge, and resist. Amidst fear, absolute control, and omnipresent propaganda, some chose another path, knowing that their decision would likely lead to their death. Share your thoughts on this episode in the comments. If you liked our content, please support us by subscribing. Thank you.